Okay, well, it is 12:15, so we are ready to start the webinar. And I am here to welcome you to the keynote address for this year's conference. My name is Dana Henriksen, and I'm an assistant professor of leadership and innovation. And I have the honor of introducing this year's keynote speaker, Dr. Shawn Loescher, who's going to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, give or take. And then we'll have a little room at the end for Q&A with Dr. Loescher. So as he's speaking, please feel free to use the chat feature to chat in questions that you would like me to ask him when we get to that point. I'll be collecting questions from the chat, and I'll try to ask as many as possible in the time that we have remaining after he finishes. And as our introduction to our speaker, Dr. Shawn T. Loescher, EDD, is an active practitioner with over 25 years of experience, both domestically and abroad, in educational innovation and school system redesign. He currently serves as a Chief Executive Officer of an inner-city school system in San Diego, California. In 2019, Dr. Loescher was named one of 16 worldwide recipients of the TED-Ed Innovative Educators Award. He earned his doctorate from this EDD program right here in the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at ASU with a focus on leadership, innovation, theory, and policy. Dr. Loescher is an American Educational Research Association awarded scholarly practitioner in action research and sciences, where he won the AERA Action Research SIG Dissertation of the Year Award for 2020. He's a sought-after keynote and TED Talk speaker, guest lecturer, consultant, and think tank participant. So we are especially honored at the opportunity to have him speak to you today as an accomplished alumni. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Dr. Loescher, and I will be monitoring the chat. So again, just a quick reminder to everyone who's watching, all the audience members, to please, as you're listening to the talk, if you have questions or things that you would like to have brought up in conversation with Dr. Loescher after he's finished talking, I'll be back on after he finishes to do that, and you can use the chat to incorporate any of those questions. And with that, I am going to turn the floor over to you. I'll turn my video off and be back soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a tremendous honor for me to be asked to be your keynote today. Just a few years ago, I was at this conference presenting just as all of you were today, learning from my fellow colleagues in the program, learning to expand my mind, to look at new thoughts, new ways of being. So I truly appreciate this as a great honor to come back to you as one of your brothers and sisters in education. And in this program and through Mary Lou Fulton's Teachers College, we're all collectively bound as part of a greater good. Today's presentation is based upon conversations that I've had with a number of people at ASU and from across the globe. One of the great privileges that I've received of being part of that TED Innovative Educational Group is on a weekly basis, I meet with educators from 36 countries around the world as we address this very, very difficult time that we're all facing both personally and professionally. In presenting this presentation today, I'm going to go ahead in the chat room, put up a link where you can download a copy of it off of my ResearchGate account. And if you don't have questions that you think of today, feel free to email me at any time, and I'm happy to get back to you with, if not answers, suggestions as to why my thinking was the way it was in developing this presentation. Today's presentation is Action Research's Praxis from Being to Becoming. And I'm sure as we go through today, you've had the opportunity to go ahead and look at the abstract in advance. And it really began for me in a journey of understanding that goes back to my childhood. As growing up, my parents were separated and I lived with my mother who really believed as education as a process of liberation. Her mother had been a New York City school teacher. Our family's tradition in education goes back many generations over, including my great-great-grandfather who opened the first co-ed high school in the United States and really had pushed the idea of Freirean concepts of what liberation should be and had studied at the Chicago School. So in looking at this and in growing up, I grew up with a mother that put herself through college and later through law school. And she was an English and philosophy major. And very early on, I got into the habit of examining words and examining their meaning. And the onset of this presentation is really a discussion about the two definitions in the English language of ontology, and how that can be a grounds up at the highest level of what defines some of our thinking around education and how that's applicable today and what it means inside of action research. I am an action researcher. I chose Arizona State University to apply to it because of its action research traditions, because of its participatory action research traditions in particular. I waited to get a doctorate till I could find a place and a home where this was valued. I had written several papers on action research and used action research for some time as my personal practice and methodology and general approach to education. Um, and it was an honor to be able to write a dissertation at a place that values it so much. Just an overview of today. Again, as an acknowledgement, thank you to everybody at Arizona State University, Mary Lou Fulton's Teachers College, the Offices of Scholarship and Innovation, and the EDD program. You are truly in one of the finest doctoral programs that is available to you. The faculty and staff are world-renowned, amazing scholars, but also they have a supportive environment for each of us that is there to help us expand our thinking. I'm going to start with this idea of the notion of being versus becoming. And then from there, because action research and all action research is contextually bound, I'm going to share a few thoughts about our current context before we look at action research as a praxis. And then look at how we might be able to reconcile these two definitions through action research in a cyclical process of improvement. And then from there, we'll open it up for some dialogue. So starting at the beginning, we have this problem of a definition. And anytime we translate words, something is lost in translation, something might be even gained, or confusion might arise. So when we look at the definition of ontology as it moves into English, we really have two ways that it can be interpreted. One is the notion of being. And if we look at this from sort of the standpoint of Jean-Paul Sartre, his notion of being is itself, being is what it is. It's just there. And that's from page 548 of his essay on ontology. But when you look at this from a definition of where Freire comes from and others in educational philosophy come from, this ontological divide becomes something that's very important, because it's not a matter of just being, it's about becoming. It's about a future state of development towards something. And so we come into this sort of play of words of being and becoming somehow needing to be reconciled together. And for me, in a process of action research, we can come to that reconciliation. And I'd like to demonstrate today how I believe that occurs. Now, action research is contextually bound. There's no way around that. And the context is a setting, a place, and a time, and what times we are in. So I want to sort of frame things up in the context of now and what we're all facing, because by the nature of your being in this program, you're already an educational leader and you're working as a scholarly practitioner. What I intend to do today is frame our discussions about what's happening in the world. To me, it demonstrates the importance of action research now more than ever. And it demands that we ask some critical questions of education and educators, more so now than ever before. This is a time of sadness and collapse, and we have to acknowledge that. People are in pain. We have people that have sickness and disease that we don't know how to treat. We have people that are suffering from joblessness and poverty that seems like it has no end. And we have to honor and respect that. But we also must look to the future and towards what's next. For we never get another opportunity to look at our core social institutions with this critical lens again in our lifetime. Before you discount yourself as a teacher or an educator or just an admin or part of a machine that has maybe formed some opinions about being part of a tradition that may lead to social cycles of oppression, let me remind you exactly how powerful you are as an educator. There is a sacred torch and mantle that you carry as a professional educator, and the world knows it. If you don't believe me and you don't believe how powerful education is and how powerful teachers are, try to remember that the first teacher evaluation on file, the first one that was ever documented and recorded, ended up with everybody being so scared that they gave Socrates the hemlock. That's how powerful you are. That's how powerful your ideas are and how powerful they can be translated. So we hold this option now sitting in front of us that's being forced upon us of making a choice. And that choice is either perpetuating what has been or looking to be what can be next in education. And that's the contextual setting that we're up against. Now, the timeline of what has happened has been very rapid indeed. November 17th is the first instance of COVID that was reported in China that we know. December, we know that things are spreading. January 20th is when it reaches the United States, and that's the first recorded instance was on January 20th, which we know now is highly incorrect in that some things had happened before that. As we moved through February, we sort of went through this watch and wait phase. But let's talk about how quickly all professional practice that we have was eradicated. On March 13th, where I am in San Diego, California, state of California, all schools were closed. My school system had been preparing for that. On March 16th, we reopened, which was Monday. We were one of the only K through 12 systems in the state of California that was open and ready to go, but with hundreds of years of practice completely gone. We had to quickly adapt to what was next. And as we move from March and into April, even now, we have school systems that are not fully online or functional. They're still struggling with what to do. Here was a quick statistical analysis or a quick situational analysis that we have been doing in our own local school systems, and I'm sharing with others. First of all, some acknowledgements as what has happened to our schools and why action research is so critical at this time in this. First of all, the first thing of what has occurred within our own field and other fields across the world comes from the notion of Kuhn's philosophy of what's called a paradigm shattering event. That means everything is out the window. We've gone through what was our normal practice, normal cycles. We started to drift, we went through a crisis, and now we're really in a process that can be a model revolution. The next thing that happened with our schools and our school districts is we went from a practice of being risk adverse to one of being risk immersed. And by that I mean schools and school systems and our teaching practices have for hundreds of years evolved very slowly when compared to other scientific practices. They're not engaged in immersion practice on a regular basis. It's part of the rub and the grind between preparing students for their future and trying to perfect the educational systems of our past. But now we're forced into this. Then the third thing is that we know this is going to compound existing factors. And by existing factors, we're talking about equity, access, oppression, and all of those social factors that are already an point of intersectionality within schools. This is going to be compounded because it cannot be escaped even to go to school. We talk about the rise of domestic violence during this time. We also have to talk about the rise of violence towards children and what's happening towards them as they cannot escape home environments that might not be the best or the healthiest for them. And next, this has factors, and I know one of our favorite theories is on wicked problems. This has implications in terms of something that has been referred to as super wicked problems. And that is a notion that in order to get through this, that somehow we're just going to discount the future. That we'll just sort of go into this mode where we'll just figure out this present problem and not think about the long-term ramifications. And we can't do that. We have to be able to look through this as a time of transformation. And that transformation is going to be driven by action research practices. Just a quick reflection on where we are to frame this. This comes from Michael Ryan from the World Health Organization. And the quote is, if you need to be right before you move, you're never going to win. Perfection is the enemy of good. Speed trumps perfection. And the problem we're having in society at this moment is everyone is afraid of making a mistake. And the greatest error is being paralyzed by the fear of failure. I want to put forward this notion as I reveal this framework that I wanted to share with you today, that for too long in education, we've been paralyzed by a fear of failure. We seek out best practices or proven, some sort of proven off-the-shelf solution that we think are secure. We've become hypnotized by the promise of generalizability, encased in traditions that may no longer be relevant, and dulled to the opportunity by the institutionalization of prediction metrics. If what is measured is what's mattered, stop for a moment and look at what we've been measuring, which is hardly the well-being or happiness of our children or society. And that really is a problem. So I want us to ask ourselves just a couple of questions, rhetorically speaking, of course. So what is the purpose of public education in schools? And by that, I mean, what has it been doing? And then at this moment of such tremendous change, maybe a second question. What ought to be the purpose of public education in schools? Now, you have to philosophically frame this. Now, I've been accused on a lot of times, even as a practitioner, as being very philosophically minded, and I am. I come from a philosophical tradition, and I'm not ashamed of that. So let's go ahead and start with our good friend, Michael Crotty, and just sort of look at things at a level of saying, what are the philosophical traditions, including what would it mean within objectivism, constructionism, and subjectivism? And then let's go ahead and jump to our friend Gutek and say, where does that fit in that normative cycle? So are you an essentialist, a progressivism, or into reconstructionism? And then ask yourself, what is the purpose of school and education? Is it support what is and what did happen? Is it supposed to be slightly suggesting what's next or trying to progress us towards something? Or is it trying to create the more ideal future that we have dreamed for our society? And those are awesome responsibilities to consider, and ones that as students and as soon as doctors of leadership and innovation, you're going to have to be confronted with on a regular basis. Now, it helps whenever talking about something to talk about a definition of it. So I wanted to choose a working definition of praxis for us today. And rather than jump into Ferrer's definition, I wanted to go to Carr and Kremis from their 1986 work on action research. And that's from page 190. And they define praxis as follows. First of all, it involves action. You can't have praxis without action. It involves reflection and informed decisions. It's orientated towards human well-being. It involves a search for a truth. And I didn't say the truth for a reason. A search for truth. And finally, it has respect for others. Now let's try to line that up with the notion of action research as praxis. Now I'm going to use citations from a number of authors here, everything from Wicked Problem Theories and Riddle and Weber to Mill's 2000 work on action research, Ivan Kova's work, Mertler's work, who's at ASU, and in looking at those and sort of cross-comparing the various points of intersectionality. I stayed out of Cresswell for this one. Action research as practice is cyclical, reflexive, it's responsive, it bends back upon itself. It's a process of resolving. That's that notion from Wicked Problems Theory, that there is no singular solution to social problems, that you're going to be resolving it over and over and over again. There's a sense in action research of connectedness, that there's research that has happened before, there's the research that's happening now, and that this cycle of research infinitely continues in the future. We do not attempt to go to generalizability in action research. Instead, we seek out this notion of transferability. What might work for me may not work for you, and what worked last time may not work next time. That brings us as practitioners back into the center of understanding that contextual setting deeply and having a connectedness to it as well. Action research as a praxis is democratic and participatory. And by this, I mean we involve others, we seek out other opinions. Next, action research, by its very tradition, seeks out a more future ideal state. Otherwise, there would be no need for action. If we believed that what we were doing right now was a form of perfection, there would be no need to make a change. So I want to take this back to that questions that I laid out before us a short time ago. What is the purpose of public education in schools? And what ought to be the purpose of public education in schools? And then how does that align within action research as a driving factor? And I would ask for us to reflect upon this in terms of how I framed it up philosophically before. Is the actions we're taking in support of what has been? Is it trying to suggest that there might be something next, or is it clearly and intentionally trying to create a more ideal future, a more just future for all people? This calls into questions the quality of the action researcher in and of itself. First of all, the action researcher has to be a scholarly practitioner. This is a tall order. It's not good enough to just be scholarly. It's not good enough just to be a practitioner. You have to be both. You have to understand the contextual setting and be part of it. And you have to have the scholastic background in order to make those informed decisions. The research in and of itself is the act of praxis when you're the action researcher. You are also a navigator of a political environment. Again, if you don't think that schools are about politics and education is about politics, again, go back and perhaps reframe that and do a secondary literature review. And even go back to that notion of what Socrates had come in at the end for very simple ideals and thoughts to be brought forward. As a navigator of that political environment, that positions the action researcher as a disruptor and change agent. That goes into that theory of the fusion of innovations, that we need to have these disruptions, and that you have to be that agent of change for your school or your school district or your classroom. Next is this interesting thing that happens to us as action researchers is we're not just the agent of change. We're not just a scholarly practitioner, we're also an instrument of the research. And we have to acknowledge that, which means we have to acknowledge our own biases, our backgrounds and experience and how they're influencing us, and do our best to report those items, not just in our research, but to share them among those that are participating in the research. Finally, we are a seeker of a more ideal future. That is our role. These are heavy responsibilities and something that we should not undertake lightly. But as educators, we are involved in a sacred trust. We're involved in this practice of raising our youth, raising our adolescents, raising our young adults, and re-educating ourselves in these institutions and systems. And it begs a question as we engage in all of these items. If action research is going to be a mode of praxis, then a praxis towards what? What I would suggest from the literature is going into Freire's notion of our first true vocation. And Freire presents this in Pedagogy of the Oppressed and through several lectures and research over time, including his Harvard series. And within this presentation, you do have a reference list. I'm hoping Dr. Buss will not check my APA on that. In terms of our first true vocation, what Freire suggests, if not really suggests, he states clearly, is that our first true vocation is to become more human at all times, all of us. And that you can't be more human by dehumanizing somebody else. And this involves the notion of a pedagogy of liberation. So I am suggesting that within action research, whether it's practical action research or participatory or any of its forms, it is a form of seeking out a pedagogy of liberation. So I want to frame this up in terms of what I stated at my own cycles of research, in terms of where we sit in the United States. And I'm going to grab a drink of water real quick. And from my own writing on this subject, I argue that we must be engaged in a pedagogy of liberation, hope, and even defiance of the mainstay factors that may have institutionalized caste systems of poverty and oppression. And I took that one step further. And I stated, and it's not on the screen, however, my situated context was not some distant land that America regards as being of a different world order. I asserted that this has happened and will continue to happen here in the land that proclaims freedom for all. It took me a long time to get to that place because we need to understand a few things about where we are, because we do love this country very much. But we need to understand that we are first in a very few things, and education has not been one of them. We are first in the world in incarcerating our own citizens. We are first in the world in defense spending, and we're first in the world in a lot of different other things, but not things that relate to advancing a more just society. And we need to acknowledge that. And if we're going to acknowledge that, then I believe we need to acknowledge that as part of action research tradition of emancipatory practice, that these problems are wicked problems. Now, I'm not just saying that because I come out of Arizona State University's program, and I'm not saying that because I went to school in the Northeast at a time when the term wicked was well, it was popular. I'm dating myself. But in terms of acknowledging that we are part of a problem, but we're also a symptom of those problems. That we need to acknowledge that the social context of where we are is not one of equality. We need to talk about resource distribution when we talk about emancipatory practice. And resource distribution is incredibly difficult in terms of grasping this. We talk a great deal about equity in education and then provide equality over and over and over again. We will never achieve an equal opportunity for all by distributing our resources and talents equally. It will only be through an equitable distribution that we will get there. We also have to question within our emancipatory practice traditions the purpose of the actions that we're taking. What are we talking about in terms of what we are doing? A lot of times in education, we believe we're doing the right thing, but we haven't necessarily thought about the implications to practice. For example, when we talk about a pedagogy of liberation and about empowering students through education, is that through liberating them from poverty or attempting to eradicate poverty in their community? Are we teaching them that the places they come from are places that are to be escaped from, that the problems there cannot be solved? Or are we teaching them to become active participants in problems within our communities so that way we can solve those community problems together? Are we talking about an attempt to eradicate the problems that are around us, or a simple treatment to allow for us to flee from them? And those are hard questions to engage in. What I'm suggesting is we need to move from a state of what is the purpose of schools and education in the public sphere into a dialogue that's ongoing, that seeks out what ought to be. And that's where several notions come in that are critically important at this time. First of all, the notion of principled innovation, not just innovation, principled innovation. Looking at how we can benefit things, about the public trust, the public good, and what we can do. The notion that there are futures of learning, not a singular way forward, that there are many options that can be out there, that there's a world of our choosing and our creation, a world that can go in any number of ways. And I want to be clear about this. As much as we want to talk about opportunity and hope and options at this time, and we should rightfully so, this also holds the potential to dramatically divide and increase opportunity and achievement gaps. So as we look at this, we have to pay careful consideration in terms of the futures of learning and what's out there. It means moving out of this notion that we can look at generalizability across the board and say that is the best practice. Right now, there is no best practice. There's no best practice for how to cope with a pandemic as a public institution. There is no best practice for classroom supports and behaviors. There's no best practice for administration. There's no best practice for district response. There's only emergent practice. And that has to be driven by action research. It must be driven by action research because that's the way that we can make informed decisions right now that leave us liberated to try new things and keep us from being scared and paralyzed of the changes that have been thrust upon us. And that is why action research as a practice is my practice for educational improvement. It has been and will continue to be until I can find the ability to find a new system. And I would close with a following thought that I came to in the opening of my dissertation that I wanted to share with you. And it simply states, through action research, what we may begin by accepting our current state as being in order to move us to a praxis of the becoming. And by this, I mean that the reconciliation of being and becoming within the traditions of ontology, for me, comes with understanding that being is a fleeting moment of time and a reflective way of addressing things. But it's also part of what we choose to become. Some of you may know that I've been involved in a series of writings on design thinking and education. And within those writings, in relation to the subject, I would suggest the following, which is something we talk about heavily in design thinking. You can either design the future or default to it. And by that, I mean, we have a natural instinct and way of going about doing things as humans. And we can either choose to fight, flee, or freeze. I'm suggesting through action research, we fight for our children's future. We fight for a more just society. We fight to evolve our schools and public institutions to better serve our populace. I do not believe that our populace is better served by us fleeing from the situation. And I believe too many of us have been freezing and trying to see what happens next and what direction we will go next. With that being said, I wanted to open this up to a dialogue on action research as practice and take any questions that you might have at this time. Thank you so much. And I see that Dana is back on the line.
Thank you, Shawn. Thank you so much for that great talk. That was inspired, and really appreciate the connections between action research and the work that the current students are doing and everything that's happening in the broader global community right now. We do have some and many compliments for you in the chat box, but we have some questions as well. So one of the questions that came up, which I think is key, and I'm sure on the minds of a lot of our students as they're trying to innovate and make change within systems, different types of systems in the field. As someone asked, as we work to revolutionize educational practice, how do we continue to educate colleagues who have not yet joined the revolution or even oppose it?
Well, that's an outstanding question. First, I believe this is a process of understanding what has occurred to us. And you know, a signature pedagogy that I was engaged in when we were in the EDD program was talking about Wegner's community of practice. And when we're talking about education and educators as having a community of practice, the community has fundamentally been shattered. And the practice is all over. And what's happening at this time, I think, is a natural human reaction. You have people clinging on to what was and trying to hold on to that with a hope that we will get past this. And I will simply share where I stand in that sort of positioning. On Monday, I'm bringing a group of educators together as we plan for the years 2020 through 2022. And what this is going to look like in terms of not having more than 8 students at a time around us, what it would look like in terms of what's different for kindergartners versus middle schoolers versus high schoolers. What I would say is, as you're trying to reach your colleagues in this, is speak truth gently, have compassion and humanity that they are going through this as well, and that this is a change that nobody's ever been asked to make. And that it's not about backing out of the conversation. It's about helping those people and supporting those people in their own form of sense making as they begin this process of really comprehending what's going on around us. I can't speak for you. For me, it has been 2 months, and it seems like only a few days for some reason at times, and other times it feels like it's been years.
Yes.
So I hope I did not dodge the question. I hope I answered it.
No, and that's, I think, also, as you pointed out at the end, a very relatable experience. People have been having this strange sense of time, feeling like a long time and just a brief minute, and everyone needs time to kind of get their bearings and make sense of where we're all at. So another great question. Do you see the action research model in our EDD program as the new indicator for change in education?
I do. I think one of the things that has happened, and I think Arizona State University is a leader in this, and Mary Lou Fulton's Teachers College has really pushed this, is that action research is coming of age. It has come from times where it had been questioned in terms of its legitimacy of research or not. And I've always struggled with that because I know where I sit with that. I sit as somebody that used action research when I was a teacher in the classroom. I've used it as an administrator for school administration. I've used it in terms of social change. I've used it in terms of district change. Right now, my school system is a laboratory school system, which means we are change agents by design. We only permit action research where we are, even at what we're doing right now. At this moment, we have no less than 8 action research studies in full swing to inform us as to what is happening and what is going on. And we do take action research seriously where I am and at other places in terms of saying our action research is IRB approved through, in our case, through a partnership with UCSD and San Diego State. If any of you are looking for a contextual setting for your research, feel free to jump on in. But in terms of where action research as presented in this program, it is, for me, what will be driving things as we move forward, because we need to become more responsive to what's happening. We can't wait right now. You know, and I want to be absolutely clear about this as an educator. I acknowledge the trauma of the situation that has occurred. But these are our children's one time in school. They don't get to be 6 or 7 or 8 again. And I can't discount their future in order to say, we'll figure this out in the next year or 2. That can't be. So right now, as an action research, you're involved and you're well positioned as an agent of change to rapidly address what's happening. It doesn't all have to be a dissertation. Let's keep that in mind, right? I know that's where we're at mentally. We gotta get there and make sure our proposals are in order and everything's there. Action research can be quick, and in my opinion, oftentimes should be quick and cyclical and just really quick informed. You don't need to do a literature review with 200 works on everything, right? So I think you're really, really well prepared in this program for being an instrument of change for districts, and I do believe it's going to be the norm.
Thank you for that, Shawn. That's one of our goals in the program, is that it's not just meaningful and transformative to students while they're here with us in courses and LSCs, but that it's something that carries forward. And I think you provided a really helpful model on how that's a part of your work and can be a part of all of our practice going forward. Another strong question here is, in the 3 theoretical perspectives continuum that you presented, is it possible for an individual to have a foot inside various categories on each of them? For instance, an educator believes that education is both something that is built on serving what is, while simultaneously building to what is to come.
Sure. So I'm a subscriber of the Deleuzian theory. I don't think any of us are in any single camp or any single way of being, whether that be via spectrums on philosophical ways of being or other things. I do believe that we primarily find ourselves in a category. And I do believe that there are times when they are opposed in terms of looking at what's there. I believe that for many of us in our own practice, as we go through and look at things, we need to acknowledge honestly the disconnection between what we claim overtly we are and what we do. And I'm just going to use a simple example on that. I've worked with a number of school districts and places and classrooms and teachers that make statements that say things such as, we're progressive educators. So that's wonderful. Now let's examine what you're doing. What we're doing is teaching out of a standardized textbook written by somebody that has no knowledge of our students, that has gone through a variety of state level committees, that has been rolled through. That's not enacting progressive education. And it's certainly not being all the way over on a reconstructive education. I think what is best to do in this is to simply look at and examine our own disconnections between what we say and what we do on an ongoing basis. And I'll be first to say, I do that regularly, where I state out loud, this is who I am, this is my practice, and then I go over and look at my practice and say, I don't do that. Something's wrong here. So I hope I'm hoping I'm answering your question. I think it's possible, and I think most of us do it either as a conscious act or a subconscious act for what's there. And I believe that oftentimes comes from a good place, because I also want to perfect the education of my youth. That's something that I have inside of me. That's part of being human. But at that same moment, if I'm perfecting the education of my youth, I also have to acknowledge that I'm not preparing the current cycle of students for their future, because their future is completely different.
Thank you, Shawn. As we come up close on 1 o'clock here, I have a few more questions for you. And as I just kind of want to say to the audience that Dr. Loescher has graciously and gracefully offered to stick around for a little bit longer. The keynote technically wraps up at 1 and the next session begins at 1:15. So please feel free to stick with us. He's going to answer a few more questions, and I'll wrap this up a little after 1 so I can move on to the next session. Thank you for all for being here, and Shawn, thank you so much for answering questions. I'll start right into just a couple more of them, and we'll see what we can fit in here in the next few minutes. So one student asked, she mentioned that she's lived outside of the US for 11 years and now sees her home country, the US, as an outsider, and that there are other students in the EDD program who live and work in schools outside of the US. So what ideas might you have for the ways in which the lenses of these students and ASU's global outreach can help to inform the discussion of how we as Americans can reclaim a leadership role in the world through our action research?
Thank you. I would frame up a few things with that. First, I have spent time outside of the US as an educator. One of my first big assignments was in Czechoslovakia, as they were dividing into a two-state solution for their problems and working through those things. I think the first thing we can do in order to reclaim a position of leadership is to acknowledge that this is not a competition between states. This is got to be a way of us coming together for all humanity. I say that at a time of looking heavily at the way things are solved scientifically in other fields such as medicine, where there is a far more and higher degree of collaboration that spans across boundaries, and they're not simply looking at things in terms of looking at metrics from a competitive standpoint. They're looking at it from a how do we solve broader problems together. And they acknowledge to an extent that those things are contextual, and to a greater and greater extent, even within medicine, they understand that things are contextually bound. That's part of what gene research has been showing us, and what things are happening now in terms of personalized treatments and ways of going about doing things. What I think we can do is something within action research we tend not to do, which is we can start publishing and we can start sharing. A lot of times we conduct action research at school sites and we don't publish and we don't share. And we say, well, it's contextually bound. Yes, it's contextually bound, but it's transferably possible that others can learn from what we have done. That we don't diminish our action research or minimize it by saying, well, it only solved a small problem, that instead we put ourselves out there. And that as scholarly practitioners, we engage as scholars as well, that we take time out to write, to inform others, to submit articles, to share, and to be sure to get the messages out there, because what's happening at your schools matters. And only through writing and through that vehicle can we engage in a healthy practice that's a scientific practice that is part of our tradition as educators. Remember, you're in a social science program, okay? You're a scientist. And as a scientist, we got to engage in scientific practice. And I think that will help us overall.
Really appreciate that point about publication and dissemination of work, because some of the most important research that gets done is research that will directly impact people's lives, students, learners, in all contexts. So I think that's really critical. And I saw a lot of yeses and virtual fist pumping in the chat box for that too. So let's see, another question was, you spoke to K-12 environments quite a bit, and with regard to our higher education or organizational colleagues from other contexts, what message would you give to them?
Yeah, not too dissimilar a message, just how it goes about being implemented would be something worth looking at deeply. I've stated that, you know, I currently specifically work with the University of California, San Diego's Design Lab, and which is headed by Don Norman. And we talk a great deal about all of these things and what has happened. I think, first of all, and I mean this not because I went to ASU, I have read about the New American University model before I had ever gone to ASU. First of all, I think this is an opportunity to return our public universities to a square focus on the public good. And that focus on the public good has got to be across the board. And it has to have a large component that's driven about what public good means in terms of a society that has become so fractured along race and equity lines, where economic and social economic factors has literally just divided us into separate realities. I'm not experiencing this pandemic the way that many of my families are. I have a garden out back. I have a place for my children to go. I'm not locked indoors in some place. So I think the message for higher education is looking at how can we remove those barriers, either through, and I'm not going to introduce too many new concepts because we're going to run out of time, through the concepts that ASU has developed in terms of looking at what is a more fair and equitable way of getting more people into higher education, and how that can be an ongoing process, and how that can be delivered in a number of ways and services that we have been fighting. And I'll speak to it as somebody that has taught at a university, and I will be upfront about it. We fight about it at Academic Senate. We fight about it in all sorts of different forums. But now that this change has been thrust upon us, we're going to be at a point where if we get back in touch with being of service for public good, it's time to adapt or die as an institution. And we need to adapt, because this is the new reality, and you're not going to change that factor, but you can change all of the variety of factors within your control.
Thank you. Another question is, what have you begun to question that you took for granted before, and what is something new that you've learned due to this crisis?
Something I questioned before, and something I've learned from this crisis, something I've been reminded from this crisis, is how frequently we like to talk about problems and how infrequently we like to look at the wonderful things that are happening. And I'm going to give a couple of quick examples, and then I'll go to the first part of the question. One of the first things that occurred, and I was sharing with some folks recently, is we were talking about the increase in unemployment in our areas. My number at my school went from about 5% unemployment to, we're predicting at this moment, just over 32% unemployment. And we're in the center, we have multiple locations, and they're in the center of downtown San Diego. And we talk about that a lot. What we haven't talked about, and we need to surface, is the number of families that have come together for each other, that have come together and circled around their children, the number of people that have done things that are absolutely phenomenal. And I'm just going to give a few examples. We're a hospitality-based economy here in San Diego. Please feel free to visit when all of this is done. See you in 2 years. But we have hotels that have closed down and restaurants that have closed down, where those families are now cooking for others in need. We have people that have reached out and said, you know, my professional offices are going to be closed. I'm going to be furloughed for the next 60 or 90 days. I came from Southeast San Diego. I am an English learner. What if I can teach kids or tutor kids that are ELs at this time, or emergent bilinguals is what we call them locally. I'm trying to use a more global language, but how can we help each other out? I'm not doing anything else. I can support that. And we forget those stories of amazing humanitarian efforts that are occurring on this micro level, just between each other. And it's occurring all the time, but particularly now it's pronounced, and I get a chance to step back and see it. One thing that I've had to re-question myself on, because it's just a new reality, is on the scope and sequence of what we teach and how we teach it, in terms of what our curriculums are and what they're not, and the fundamental skill sets that our kids need, and how much we have that has become incumbent upon us as educators to provide, and how that's been flipped upside down. Really, I'm challenging myself and my team to look at what is the nature of relationships and social emotional learning and well-being within our education structures. What are the skill sets that we need to teach to allow children to teach themselves from a very young age? And how do we go about looking at this new reality as a different way of being? And then the next component is, what does that mean for parents? I'm fortunate I study education, so my kids are doing fine. But for other families, how are we going to go about doing this? How do we educate parents? And then How do we put a critical lens on everything from equity and access? And it's got to be on everything. It's not simply a matter of saying, well, it's food distribution resources. It's food, it's healthcare, it's literacy levels, it's what needs to be done for contacts, it's about cyberbullying, it's about everything. So I've been in this process re-questioning myself on everything we do and the scope and sequence of it.
Thank you, Shawn. With that, I'm noticing we're right at 1:10 and the next session is starting at 1:15. So I'm going to give you the last word before I close it off here. Is there any final thoughts that you have for our students and for where everybody's at right now in this moment?
No, I just want to again thank you and everybody at Arizona State University for having me today and restate what a tremendous an honor it has been, first to be a part of the program, to have learned from all of you, and to be able to make this very, very small contribution back to the program. Please feel free to contact me at any time if I can ever be of service to what is happening there. I say to all of you that are out there, again, congratulations on being part of what is quite likely the finest doctoral education program in the United States. You've made a wise decision and you are investing your time well. With that said, thank you so much, Dr. Saad. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you so much for being here with us. It was an honor to work with you in the program. It's been exciting to see all of your accomplishments, and it's been wonderful to have you be part of the event today. So thank you for sharing your time and insight and expertise. And with that, I'm going to wish everyone an excellent rest of the afternoon, rest of the conference. We'll move on into the next sessions and hope you all stay safe and healthy. And Shawn, thank you, best wishes, and hopefully to see you soon.